Hey everyone, welcome back to Humanology on Air. My name is Jeeves. My co-host Josiah is not here today, and that is because he's made some interesting life choices that involve a dirt bike with his nephews and now some knee surgery. So it is you and me today, and today I am taking this little show on the road, and we are going to LinkedIn Canada's headquarters in Toronto, and I will be talking to Jan Schwartz. He is the founder of the B2B Institute. He's got lots of interesting research to share with us. So let's just jump in. Good to see you. Today we are at the LinkedIn offices in Toronto, and I am joined by Jan Schwartz, a very special guest. Jan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Jan Schwartz. I'm the founder of a thing called the B2B Institute, which is a think tank funded by LinkedIn, and we study B2B marketing, selling, buying in partnership with leading academics and industry experts.
So the last time we talked to anyone from LinkedIn, we were talking to Jeff Lancaster, and he was talking to us about the mental model of the 95-5 rule, right? And so that mental model was really all about, if I'm not mistaken, the importance of building brand while people are out of market so that when they're in, you're memorable and you're set up, right?
Correct. So the 95-5 rule is a very important finding we came up with in partnership with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, a professor there, distinguished professor there named John Dawes, who came up with the 95-5 rule, which is statistically proving that 95% of buyers are out of market at any given time, and only 5% of buyers are in market, which means that only 5% of the time you can think of someone as an active buyer. 95% of the time you have to think of that person as a buyer that needs to be influenced through brand and not through products and features.
So based on what you just said about the 95-5 rule, we're leaning into brands. Great. But we are here today to talk to you because it turns out there's a problem with not the research is correct, but there's sort of a wider implication outside of the marketing department.
Yeah, so the issue with talking about the importance of brand in B2B marketing and the need to invest in long-term brand building the relationship with the buyer over multiple years when they're out of market before they come into market. The issue with that is that that's a concept that's hard to sell to the CFO or the CEO who are very short-term focused, in part because brand is too vague a description, right? If you ask 10 marketers what they think the definition of brand is, you're gonna come up with 11 different definitions of what brand is. So this is not a helpful concept. Marketing has a language problem. So what we came up with is this very simple concept of what is your promise to the customer? How do you articulate that customer promise in a way that is memorable, valuable, and deliverable? That is a much more specific way of framing the same thing and doing it in a way where the CFO and the CEO and your grandmother or your 5-year-old child actually understands what you're talking about. Everybody has heard of a promise. Everybody implicitly understands what a promise is, and everybody responds to being made a promise and wants to see it fulfilled and wants to see it delivered.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But if I can pull it back, so you ask 10 marketers what's brand, they give you, what is a brand? They give you 11 answers. And what you're saying is like, no matter what, you need to be nailing this customer or promise to the customer. And so my question is, does that come before, say, your vision statement and your lofty why statement and your key messages about products and benefits and features and things like that? Because these would be different answers that people would give you about, like, okay, what is brand comprised of?
Yes, Jen. So the answer to, I would say the answer is you have to do the basics first. You have to start with the customer and you have to ask, what is it that we are promising her or him? And how do we articulate this in the language that the customer actually understands? We are not saying by any means that having a company purpose, having a vision, having 150 different functionalities and features of your product that you're very proud of, we're not saying that any of that is wrong. What we're saying is before you communicate all that, you first really need to nail what is the promise that you're making to your customer, and does your marketing messaging and your sales messaging and any other messaging that comes out of your business actually reflect that customer promise. That's where you should start. Once you have that, you can build on that. And unfortunately, what we found in our research is a lot of companies have forgotten about exactly what they're promising to the customer. And they're trying to get too clever in their advertising and their messaging, where they talk about a lot of other things that are more to do with themselves as a brand, as a company, and not so much with what is the value they're creating for the customer, i.e., what are they promising to the customer.
So, examples. Do you have anything that you can?
Yes, there are many examples in B2C and B2B of what a good promise constitutes. For me, the platonic ideal of a really compelling promise is the car insurance company in the US called Geico. They have a horrible name that no one understands what it stands for, because it stands for Government Insurance Company. They solved that very elegantly by having a gecko, a little green gecko, that reminds people of the brand name. So they do the first thing right of a promise. They are memorable. Geico, gecko, that's a memory that I understand. But then they actually make their promise valuable, because they say 15 minutes could save you 15% on car insurance with Geico. So it's a very specific statement of value in an industry like insurance that is a very vague industry, where the product isn't really visible and you can't really know what the product does unless you have an accident, which you don't really want to do. So Geico very beautifully solves this problem by having a memorable gecko, having a very clear tagline about how they're going to save you money and they're going to save you time. And then they make it deliverable, because if you go on geico.com or you call 1-800-GEICO, you get the result you're looking for. So it's a very neatly packaged promise that's very simple and easy to understand. So that's a good B2C example. I'm happy to give you a B2B example.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So a good B2B example is two recent companies I've seen doing great work here are both ServiceNow and Workday. Both of them are in the workflow business. They are doing back office stuff. In the case of Workday, they're working for finance and HR people. And Workday had a very good Super Bowl spot where they made it about actual rock stars complaining that regular business people in HR and finance would use the word rock star and call each other a rock star, when in fact that should be reserved for real rock stars. So it's a bit goofy. It's a bit, dad humorish, but it brings the promise across very clearly, which is, if you're an HR and finance person and you work with Workday, people are going to call you a rock star. So the tagline of "be a finance and HR rock star" is very cleverly done, because it speaks to the emotional need state of HR and finance people want to feel valued, they want to feel seen, they want to have status, and an effective promise to the customer gives the customer status in their respective environment, and that's what Workday does. And then ServiceNow used to be a very utilitarian company in the way they talked about their value. They would talk about enterprise workflow management is what we do. And they've since taken a turn towards much more emotional messaging that makes a promise of, that feeling when work just works and you don't have to worry about stuff. That's what you're going to get if you use ServiceNow. And so making work is a really clever way of making a specific promise to the customer of what they actually care about, which is they don't want to worry about workflow and they want to trust the provider to take care of it for them. So they've both been on a journey from much more functional utilitarian to much more functional and emotional benefits, combining that, which is a good thing to do.
So it's not the case that you have to make this promise at the expense of like this big creative idea. You can sort of integrate these two things. You can make it emotional. You can like make it a hook and interesting and memorable. It's not just like this dry promise necessarily.
That's right. You don't need to make a functional promise about your product, although you can. Right. There's one example where a telecom company wanted to provide Wi-Fi services and said, we have unbreakable Wi-Fi. That's what we provide to you. That's a bold and simple promise. But there's also a way to do it in much more intuitive, emotional ways and in much more creative, elaborate ways. The promise framework is very flexible in how you execute it. It's just the mindset of put the customer first and articulate the value that you provide for the customer in the right way that the customer understands it. You can do that in a very elaborate way, or you can do that in a very simple, straightforward way. It can be emotional, it can be functional, it can be both. There's different ways to do it, but you have to make a promise to the customer in your messaging, otherwise you're wasting money.
Right. So if we use like a bad example, I think you mentioned earlier off camera, a Tide ad that was like,
yes,
#1. It's the best.
Yes.
So you should use it.
I'm happy to go on record because Roger Martin, who is our co-creator of this framework, he has been P&G's strategy advisor for many, many years, and we have a very warm relationship with Mark Pritchard, the CMO, and the rest of the P&G crew. And we had a conversation with them around how some of P&G's advertising is incredibly strong when it comes to delivering promises, and some of the advertising that talks more about Tide is the #1 brand in North America or in America, we're the #1 detergent, we're really great. That's not a bad thing, but it's a missed opportunity, I would personally argue, to actually make it more about the customer. Because really the customer shouldn't care whether you're the #1 brand. They should care that you're a brand that's really good because you do something valuable for them, i.e. you help them clean their clothes. So that's a good example of how more of a customer focus is often a much better way to go than just talking about how great you are as a brand and how you're #1. Good for you, but what does it do for me as a customer? What it does for the customer, that's what matters.
Right. This is a complete aside, but I'm just asking you because I'm interested. I was thinking about like the Tide example and saying like, okay, we help you clean your clothes. That, I mean, is a legitimate promise, but it's not like a differentiated promise, right? Because, you know, Purex could say the same thing and Sunlight could say the same thing. But maybe it's a good opportunity for us to talk about like what makes a good promise, other than the fact that like, yes, you need to be able to deliver on it. That I assume would make, but like what else constitutes a good promise?
Yeah. Well, what makes a good promise in a B2B or B2C marketing context is have it be memorable enough for people to care. Have it be valuable enough so people understand what is the value I'm getting. Because if it's too vague, oftentimes people won't understand what is the specific value I'm getting. And then finally, it absolutely needs to be deliverable. If a promise is not deliverable, you're doing more harm than good, right? And that's why it's often problematic to try and make too bold a claim about how you're going to make the world a better place, because that's not a verifiable thing that a customer will really be able to see whether you do that for them or not.
Right. And it might not be something that means a lot to them for like that particular product. Like, yes, as you said, like, yes, people want to change the world, but like, that's not why I'm buying this particular toothpaste. Like, that's why I might donate to this cause. But when I'm buying my toothpaste, I don't necessarily need you to deliver on that promise in this exact moment.
Yeah.
I need you to fight gingivitis.
Yeah. No, I can actually think of a really great B2B example of a compelling promise that is both specific enough, but also kind of emotional and aspirational. And that is Figma, which is a design tool. And it's a piece of software that you use to do product mock-ups, etc. And they've done an incredibly clever campaign that is based on the premise that nothing great gets created alone. And what's exciting is the creative really demonstrates that using the Figma tools. And so it's a very high-minded promise to the customer, meaning greatness is achieved as a team effort, but it's also specific enough to say, well, we give you the tools that your team will be able to use to collaborate together to create something really great. So that's one of my recent favorites, the Figma work that was done by an agency called Collins. That's B2B marketing done at a standard that is really excellent.
So let's talk a little bit about the specific research that you have done. What have you found and how did you come up with these findings?
Yeah, so we worked with WARC, a very esteemed research firm who had a very large base of campaigns, a database of campaigns, over 2,000 of them, and we were able to slice and dice them by whether or not they made a clear promise to the customer. And what we found is a very stark difference in terms of key business performance metrics such as brand health increase, market share increase, or long-term sales growth. And the results were very stark because, for example, there's an over 60% differential in terms of the magnitude of a market share increase between campaigns that make a promise to the customer versus campaigns that don't. And in terms of all the campaigns who really drove a long-term business results, which is the most important metric in many ways, 67% of them made a promise to the customer versus only 33 did not make a promise to the customer, which is a huge, huge difference to the total number where only 40% of all campaigns made a promise and 60% did not. So all the real winners, the percentage of the winners was much, much higher amongst promise to the customer campaigns versus non-promise to the customer campaigns.
Yeah, that's a really big deal. What struck me was the long-term affect of the promise to the customer. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about how that compares to sort of this short-term, very like viral thinking that marketers tend to have. And in fairness, we have them because we are measured on them in so many ways, right?
Yeah, so a key surprising finding was that campaigns that make a clear promise to the customer, they do okay when it comes to generating social buzz and other short-term metrics, but they do much, much better than non-promise campaigns when it comes to long-term business growth. And so the challenge we face as an industry is we're so focused on short-term performance and short-term metrics that we don't see how big of a delta there is when you zoom out and look at it in the long term, which is why I think a lot of this like the simple truth of you need to make a promise of value to the customer has been forgotten by the industry because they're so focused on short-term metrics rather than looking at long-term business effects.
Right, which is interesting, like tying it back to selling it into the C-suite, because being able to demonstrate long-term growth is actually probably something that executives care much more about than like, hey, we got a lot of likes today on Instagram.
Exactly. So the big challenge the marketing industry has, and in particular the B2B marketing industry, is this disconnect of the C-suite not understanding the language that marketers use, not understanding a word like brand. And it's much better for us to narrow the focus and say, let's not talk about brand, let's talk about what promise did we make to the customer and how did we deliver on that promise. That's a much easier concept to get across with a CFO and a CEO. And also it's a much easier concept for the entire marketing and sales organization to get behind, because people who are on the brand marketing team feel very differently about the word brand than people who are, say, on the demand gen team or the sales team, when in fact they should all be working together to deliver the right promise at the right time to the right customer, and deliver it in a way where it actually can be fulfilled by the product that or service that you're selling.
So the customer promise is a new mental model. Some of you might be thinking, why do we need new mental models?
That's a good question. So I think mental models help us understand the world better. And there's a lot of existing mental models in marketing that are helpful, but somewhat limiting. Like, let me give you an example. The one is, say, the funnel, right? The funnel implies that there's a very linear B2B buyer journey, and that it's individuals who need to be led through that funnel, and you know exactly what stage they're in. That is a helpful mental model compared to not having one, but it's actually not very accurate in terms of what the reality is of the B2B buying process. The B2B buying process is actually a lot more complicated. It involves a large group of very different people who are all interconnected. It involves people who are not actually part of the company you're trying to sell to, but are external influencers, such as experts, or even just personal business contacts of the people who are in the decision-making roles. And so all of that needs to be incorporated, and it's not exactly reflected very well by the existing model of a B2B buying funnel. Another example is this idea that the best product wins, right? You, as a B2B marketer or B2B salesperson, you just have to tout the features and benefit of the particular product or service you're selling. And if you do a good enough job selling the features and benefits, then you win. It's actually not true. That's a flawed mental model. The reality is that people don't think about your product or your brand very often. They are out of market for 95% of the time. They don't actively think about you. And what you need to do instead is you need to really think about what is the promise of value that we're making to that audience, and how can we communicate that in many different ways, in ways when they're not actively marketed, they're actually going to respond to. And that involves a lot of what we'd call brand marketing efforts, in addition to lead gen and sales efforts.
So a question for you, why do you think that brand is so difficult? I feel like when you're a marketer, it's like, it's obvious, you just get it. Why is it hard for others to get?
No one else within our company and on the customer side cares as much about the concept of brand as we do. And that's why it's incredibly helpful to have a new mental model, such as what is the promise we're making to our customer, which replaces the very broad concept of brand and gives it much more of a specific bent that is easily understood by your CEO, your CFO, and most importantly, by the customer themselves. And that is a much more precise way of getting to the same place as saying, we need to build a brand. We need to convince our customer that our brand is special, that we stand out. It's a much more direct way of saying, how do we create value as a business, and how do we make that value understood, and how do we make all stakeholders in our own company, and most importantly, amongst our client base and our future client base, understand what that value is. So that's a much cleaner way of getting to the same place than saying we need to build a brand, we need to invest in a brand. That is going to raise a lot of skepticism and a lot of questions, versus saying we need to convey the promise that we make to our customer in an effective way. That seems much more straightforward and easier to do. So it's a better mental model of how to think about it than brand.
Right. And then all of the tenets of brand building actually can just rally around the promise to the customer in terms of saying, well, we need to do this consistently. We need to do this with this voice, and we need to make it look this certain way.
Absolutely.
And we need to communicate this promise across the board and
that's right.
in various ways.
That's
so
right.
yeah.
That's right. We're not trying to, so what's interesting about promise to the customer as a mental model is we're not trying to replace any existing activities. We're just trying to sharpen it and make it more easily understood as to what is the core of the value creation. What do we need to do first? Once you've understood what your promise to the customer is, then you can layer on additional activities. Then you can talk about your brand more broadly, etc. But then you can get really creative, but it needs to have a clear promise to the customer at its core.
So how does promise to the customer connect marketing to the rest of the organization?
It removes the internal silos that have existed in an organization for many decades and in all different kinds of industries to an extent where you're able to connect much better across the silos because you're unified by a shared desire to make a promise, project that promise, make sure it lands with the audience. That is the job of many different departments, not just marketing. And I think that's what the world needs more of, rather than divisive language that only speaks the language of a particular silo within a particular business unit. Because let's face it, the customer does not care whether you work in marketing or sales or product. They just want something that is valuable to them, that makes their lives better and easier, right? They don't really care how you're organized. They don't really care who gets credit for what within your team or within your organization. They just want something that's valuable to them. And that's where we need to start.
Yeah, so it's like an entry point. Like, not only is it effective for long-term sales and brand lift and all these things, it's actually an entry point for like organizational collaboration. So it's sort of a win-win.
That's exactly right. It's the way we like to think of it is that customer promise is the framework that unifies both marketing and broader business strategy around a very simple idea that the CEO can understand, the janitor can understand, my grandmother could understand. It's very accessible, and that's what's powerful. Good ideas are always simple and seem obvious once you've created them.
So we have one more question, and that is for the people watching. They have one takeaway, one thing that they can maybe action today or this week. What can they do?
My suggestion is very simple, which is go back to your teams and ask them, what do they think is the promise that we as a company are making to our customers? And how do we fulfill that promise? How do we communicate that promise? It's a very simple question. It's a non-threatening way of phrasing things, but it will unlock a lot of helpful conversation, and it will unlock a lot of helpful insight into where do we need to sharpen our messaging, how do we make our messaging more accessible, and how do we unify everyone within the company around a very simple message? Because the world needs more simplification of complexity. It doesn't need more adding complexity to the already existing complexity. Let's face it, we all want to have a simpler life and an easier to understand life, not a more complicated life. And that's why an effective promise to the customer helps with that.
Well said. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Jen.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you again.